Today, Leica has made a pretty interesting move in the history of the M camera. So this is the brand new Leica M EV1, which is a new addition to the M portfolio of cameras and answers many requests of Leica users. So the Leica M EV1 is the first camera in the M system to feature an integrated electronic viewfinder instead of the traditional rangefinder. So there's a lot to unpack here today, and many of you who've watched my videos before know that I am a huge fan of the rangefinder. The M11 I think is one of the best cameras that Leica has ever made. The rangefinder is an interesting experience, and it's kind of the fountain pen of photography. Once you use it, it's really hard to want to go back to anything else, and that's what I love about the M system. So I will admit I had to go into this with a very open mind, but I will say that after using this a little bit, I started to develop a different opinion on this, and we'll unpack this in just a second. So full disclosure, Leica invited me to Italy last month, and I got to spend some time with the new camera, and also a big shout out to my buddy Jordan Drake for helping me out with B-roll and making me look cooler than I actually am, of course. So here it is, the first Leica M with an electronic viewfinder. Now, one thing that's important to state up front is that Leica are not replacing the rangefinder. In fact, the way they're viewing this is the product line falls into three distinct segments. So you've got your analog cameras that still use film, you've got your digital rangefinder cameras, and now we have a third variety of M camera which uses the electronic viewfinder. So the Leica M EV1 is based around the M11, M11P. It has the same 60 megapixel tri-resolution sensor and Maestro 3 image processor. It offers up to 15 stops of dynamic range. It's incredible. It also uses the feature that allows for Leica content credentials for digital authentication. We saw this on the M11P, and the camera features 64 gigabytes of internal storage like we saw in the original M11. And of course, the camera is slightly lighter than the M11P since the rangefinder is excluded. So this is basically the same body as the M11, M11P, with a couple exceptions. You're going to notice that the ISO dial has been removed. This is because the electronic viewfinder takes up all of that space. So if this is something you need a lot, you can assign it to one of the custom function buttons, or you can easily access it from the menus. You'll also see there is still a front window on the camera. Well, this is for the self-timer light. Now, the new electronic viewfinder, you're going to notice, is very similar to what we have on the Q3 and the Q3-43 cameras. It is the 5.6 million dot resolution variety, which is excellent. It's a 0.5 inch with a 0.76x magnification display. And of course, it also has a built-in diopter, so if you need to dial this into your vision, you may do so. The viewfinder does have some options for focus aids. You can use focus peaking. You can also crop in for critical focus. Now, like the Q3 and Q3-43, we can apply a digital crop. We've got a 60 megapixel sensor, so if you want to crop in, and this will work like a rangefinder because you just see frame lines that come up on the screen. Now, this will let you crop in digitally in camera, so you can use a variety of lenses, obviously, because this is an interchangeable lens camera, and so you're going to be able to do a 1.3x crop or a 1.8x crop. Of course, if you're shooting RAW, full data will remain intact, so if you want to change your mind about the crop later, you can certainly do that. Now, an interesting design choice that Leica has made with the M EV1. So on rangefinder cameras such as the M11, you've got this two-way selection dial, which allows you to change the frame lines for different lenses. And it allows you to, while you have, let's say, a 50mm lens on, and you want to flip this over and kind of see what the composition would look like with a 90, let's say, you can do that on the fly. So this two-way selection is still here on the M EV1, but it is just simply two different functions. Now, these are both customizable, but by default, the way the camera's set up is if you move this dial towards the lens, it's going to toggle on and off focus peaking. If you move it away from the lens, it's going to enable the digital cropping, so you round robin through those crop modes. You can change these to whatever you want them to be. And of course, we still have the custom function button just like we had on the M11, M11P. It's on the top of the camera. This is customizable, but by default, if you press this, it will zoom the magnification in for critical focus in the electronic viewfinder. If you want to change any of these custom functions, you simply long press whatever it is that you want to assign. A little menu will pop up and you can make your change there. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about my experience with the M EV1. And as I said before, I had to go into this with a very open mind because for me, the M and the whole idea of the rangefinder, which personifies the M for me, is something that's so important. And you hear people compare it to the fountain pen of photography, and it really is. And there's a number of things that I love about it. With a rangefinder, it's a very fast way of manual focusing. And the other thing is that I like the fact that you see the frame lines, you can see outside the frame lines with the M. And that's something that for me as a photographer is very important when you're trying to anticipate other things that could be happening in the picture. And so at first, the M EV1 kind of seemed like this training wheels version of the camera. But I went in with an open mind and I wanted to see what this camera was all about. And Leica allowed us to use it. We had a couple days with the camera. And I found that this was actually very surprisingly useful in a number of ways. Now, as much as I love the rangefinder, I will be the first to admit that it does have some limitations to it. So this kind of addresses all of those limitations, and let me kind of go through these one by one. First of all, minimum focus distance. So the minimum focus distance on a rangefinder is limited because of the mechanism of the rangefinder. So the minimum focus on any lens is going to be usually 1 meter, and then with some lenses you can focus down to 0.7 meters. And so for uses like macro, it becomes very difficult. I have done a lot of macro work with M cameras before, as you guys have seen these videos. I absolutely love the 90mm macro Elmar lens. However, macro does require that you use the VisiFlex viewfinder, and so that's an attachment you have to put on. It's not a big deal, but it's kind of nice to have a camera where that's already built in. Another limitation of the rangefinder is focal length with lenses. So you have a limitation on the field of view with the viewfinder, and so it's about 28mm. So if you want to use a 24 or a 21 or something even wider, you're just not going to be able to frame that up correctly using the viewfinder. You're going to have to use an external viewfinder or something else to actually be able to compose correctly. The other thing I would actually argue is there is a limitation on the long end. Now, with any rangefinder camera, 135mm is about the max limit that you're going to get. Now, if you've ever used the 135mm apotelite lens, you'll know that it is very difficult to focus with sometimes, and the rate of error is very high because, like, we're talking about a focal length where if I just barely move the lens or it's just slightly out of focus, well, that could be 6 inches or 4 inches, and it could throw your focus in the long run. So using long lenses, you're really pretty much pushing the boundary with 135mm. Now, with Nikon in the old days, with their rangefinders, they had ways of actually attaching a reflex system, so you could use things like a 500mm lens, but that's something that's not possible inherently on the M cameras without modification. Well, now an electronic viewfinder makes all that super easy. Another limitation with the rangefinder is going to be the frame lines. Now, depending on your focal length, sometimes with the longer lenses, the frame lines are mostly accurate, but if something is really critical that's going to happen on the edge of the frame, again, I don't trust it. I'll either use live view or use a VisiFlex because they do have a little variance in them. Another challenge with the rangefinder is being able to do selective focus with lenses with extremely shallow depth of field. Lenses like the 0.95 50mm Noctilux. It's a great lens. It requires an enormous amount of practice to use. And another lens that I don't own for obvious reasons because it's very expensive, but it's probably one of the best lenses Leica has ever produced, is the 75mm Noctilux, which has a maximum aperture of f1.25. This is extremely shallow when you're trying to shoot portraits and just having an eye in focus, and the EVF makes it so much easier to get consistent results. And another challenge that I think relates to lenses is for people who like to use old vintage lenses with wide apertures. So if you're talking about old 50mm f1.4 lenses, another one that I absolutely love is the 75mm Summilux. It's an f1.4. Wide open, the focus point, well, it never really gets sharp. And so you can get great images with those cameras, but focus point placement is extremely important and something that's kind of crucial to getting good images with that. So if you're dealing with, these great vintage looks, I think having a viewfinder, there's an argument here for being able to really dial in exactly where you want that focus point to be and also what you want out of focus. You really do need that what you see is what you get experience. And another thing that's nice with an EVF is you do have live exposure compensation preview. So for instance, if you're in a dark area, like there were these tunnels that were in this winery that we were photographing, and there were some cool shots in there I wanted to get, and you would need to underexpose for this, but when you have a viewfinder and you have that live view, you can tell exactly how much you need to underexpose to get the shot just right. So these are things that you're not going to get in a rangefinder, and it does actually make sense to have with an EVF. Now, I realize the M EV1 is not going to be right for everyone because just having an electronic viewfinder does not solve things like the fact that there is still no autofocus. We don't have in-body image stabilization, and these cameras do not shoot video. So they're not going to be right for everyone, but my argument is, and it has been for a while, that if those are things that you want, well, Leica makes the SL cameras, and they do those really well. You could even make the argument that the Q cameras, if you're okay with a fixed lens, are going to do that really well also. So it's not going to solve every issue, but Leica do have other products in those categories. So what are the advantages to the M EV1, you might be asking? Well, I would say first and foremost is going to be form factor. That's one of the things that I love the most about the M11. I think it's one of the best cameras Leica's ever done because of the size. It is very compact, it is very stealth, and you're going to maintain that using the EV1. I think also another argument is going to be the 60 megapixel sensor that comes in the M11, M11P, as well as the processor. This is one of the best combinations I've used on any system. Yes, there are other cameras that have 60 megapixel sensors, but I think think the implementation here is just incredible. You have 15 stops of dynamic range at the base ISO, but more interesting to me is the way that this sensor and processor handle low light situations in high ISOs. It doesn't fall apart, and I can easily use this camera up to 12,500 ISO. It really is fantastic. But the biggest thing for me on this camera is now that we have an electronic viewfinder, it opens up the options that you have with lenses, especially lenses that you might want to adapt. So for instance, Leica has the old R mount lenses that are really pretty incredible, and they can be found for pretty good deals online used. They don't make them anymore, and you can get an R to M adapter and now use them. One of the challenges with adapting lenses sometimes on a rangefinder is if the lens doesn't support rangefinder coupling, then focus is turned off. So now that is no longer a point with the EV1. Now I understand, and you can argue, that just buying the VisiFlex adapter gives you an electronic viewfinder. However, that does take up your hot shoe space. I like to keep a grip there. Some people like to use a flash, so it does take away some options. I actually argue that the EV1 viewfinder is way better than the VisiFlex 2. There's no noticeable delays and things. It's a better picture. It's a really good resolution, and Leica have done a first-class job with this. So the M EV1 represents a new tool in the M ecosystem, and I want to reiterate, Leica are being very adamant that it will not replace the rangefinder. The rangefinder is still the driver behind the M cameras, and that will continue in the next version when it comes out as well. So they're not abandoning the rangefinder. However, in my experience with using this, and as I mentioned earlier, I had to keep an open mind with this because I am an M purist when it comes to a rangefinder. But after using it and having a little bit of time with it, I think for me, I realized that this does open up opportunities for a lot of people. For instance, I know people who have vision issues, and the rangefinder is just not a viable option for them. Well, having the EV in this camera now gives somebody who can't use a rangefinder the option to do so. And it gives you access to all the things that make the M so awesome, with the compact size, the stealth form factor. So for me even, I think this is going to be a very useful tool. And my use case in particular is not to replace the rangefinder, but it's using certain types of oddball lenses, things that are either too wide or too long that challenge the rangefinder format, things that come in different focal lengths. Like for instance, there's a lot of great lenses that you can use on these cameras that are like, let's say 85 millimeters. Well, there's no 85 millimeter frame line, so you have to use 90 or 75 and either add or subtract. And so it's a way of actually being able to use those much easier. And I think especially for vintage lenses or lenses with extremely shallow depth of field to be able to shoot wide open and nail that focus every time, I think it is something that is very useful. Again, for me, it does not replace the rangefinder either, but I do think it's a useful option. I would, of course, love to know what you guys think, so drop me a comment below, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.